Awesome. Well, let me get situated here. I'm not usually up front here. I've done a lot of things over the years, but I'm Zach, and I'm happy to be back. All right. So, thank you. When I do occasionally fill in here, I like to do something a little different, whereas, I'm trying to find the sweet spot. Whereas my dad's style is a lot of focusing on specific texts of the Bible and how they apply to our lives. I like to take a different perspective and examine different themes that we see throughout the Bible. So I'm going to talk about another theme in the Bible today. But whereas in the past I've talked about different ideas or different virtues that, such as generosity or testing or such things that we see throughout the pages of the Bible, today I'm going to be talking about a setting. I'm going to be talking about the city. Can you guys say the city? That's right. I like interaction because I usually teach the kids, and it helps make sure they're not falling asleep on me. Only that guy I was holding is allowed to fall asleep in here. So I'm going to talk about this city, the theme of the city throughout the Bible. And as you might have noticed, we have our kids in here with us today, partially to cheer me on, but or boost my confidence. But kids, as you listen along today, if you grabbed an activity sheet or if you grab one of the papers next to you, you can keep track of the number of times I say the keyword city today, right? So that'd be time number 3. So keep a tally, and we'll have a prize for you at the end. And as you can see, I have some things that I'll bring up and talk about as we go along. So the city. I don't know about you, but especially growing up when I was a kid, I liked to build. I liked to build things. I had Tinker Toys, Lincoln Logs, Legos, Connects, all sorts of things. So I built a lot of things over time. I never did have much skill with carpentry, but I tried my hand at a little hoverboard or a trebuchet or little gadgets like that growing up. I entertained myself. It was a lot of fun. But we, as humans, we want to build things, right? We want to make things that will be here after us. We want to create. We want to explore. We want to express ourselves. And that's how we were created, right? In the very beginning of the Bible, God created the heavens and the earth. He shaped man out of the dirt, breathed his life into him, and he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, rule, and subdue it, right? So it's part of who we are, of our purpose is to build. But I want you to think to yourself for a minute. I want you to think about different cities in the Bible. When you think about different cities, what are some of the ones that come to your mind? You know, do you think of Jericho? Do you think of Sodom and Gomorrah? Do you think of Nineveh? Do you think of Babylon or Jerusalem? Rome, right? Paragons of human virtue in the Bible, right? Not quite. And that's what we're going to explore today. Let me go ahead and grab my Bible, and what I'm going to talk about first is some of the tools that I use to notice themes in the Bible, right? So to build something, you got to have the right tools. I'm often reminded of that when I jump into a home improvement project too early, and I'm quickly stopped, realizing I don't have the proper tools I need. Has happened a lot lately as we moved into a new place a couple of months ago. But you need the right tools. So let's talk about some of the tools I like to use as I read through the Bible, as I study it, and as I try to notice themes throughout the Bible. And if I had gone to seminary, I probably could have come up with a really clever acronym for each of these steps, but you'll just have to bear with me and try to remember them, okay? But to aid that, I have some giant props that'll hopefully sear these into your mind, okay? All right, so you've seen this a few times, I think. But my first tool is observation, or to observe, right? You guys ever use these as you were a kid? Check out those ants marching along the sidewalk. Hopefully you didn't try to hurt them, right? In checking out things. And so the first step in noticing themes in the Bible is to notice, right? Is to observe, is to make sure that you are keeping an eye out for things. You're not just reading to get through or reading for a sense of guilt or you feel like you should, but you're trying to observe. You're trying to ask yourself, what is the author trying to tell me, right? What is the author trying to tell me? If you notice things at both the beginning and end of the Bible, there's a pretty good chance that you'll find that same theme carries throughout the story of the whole Bible, right? Okay. So first is to observe, right? You never would have noticed those ants on this sidewalk if you hadn't pulled out your magnifying glass, right? Would have stepped right over them. All right. It's a little worse for wear. All right. So second step is practice or perspective. Practice or perspective. So you may observe that, I noticed the same idea comes up multiple times through the Bible. So what next? Well, you should practice some perspective, and I have another tool down here to remind us of that. Oh, yeah. I didn't know if all the kids would know what binoculars are, so I brought a camera instead. But you got to practice some different perspective, right? So just like, there we go. Just like with a camera where you can zoom in, where you can zoom out, where you can choose what you frame in the image, you should practice different perspectives. So if I notice a theme in the Bible, I may ask, well, who was the original audience for this text, right? Who was the author? Who was writing these words? When were they written, right? What would they have meant to people then? What might they mean to us now, right? You're looking for different perspectives. You might zoom into the story and pay attention to some of the specific words that are used, or you may zoom out and ask yourself, well, how does this fit in with the bigger story of the Bible, right? You know, in my training, especially in medical school, they teach us this thing called metacognition. Long word. Doctors like those, but it just means thinking about thinking, right? You're thinking about the way you're thinking. So if you can imagine a museum exhibit for me, you're walking through the museum exhibit and you can think about it in a couple different levels. You can ask yourself, wow, these are really cool artifacts or paintings that I see. Like, I wonder who made these and what they were thinking and feeling when they did. Then there's another level of thinking where you can say, when the curator of the museum arranged all these things, I wonder why they put them in this order, why he arranged them in the way he did. What story is he trying to communicate to us by the way that all of these things were arranged for me to see? All right, I think you got what I'm going for there. So the next step is application or apply, right? You can think about painting a wall. You're applying that paint to the wall. So what does this theme, what does this idea, what does this story mean for my life today? How does it apply to me and what I'm going through, right? Okay, and last one is prayer. Just like you hopefully have a little cushion for your knees when you're working on a long day. It's always a good idea to pray, to ask God about what you've been noticing, to ask God for insight. You know, the Bible says, if you desire knowledge, if you desire wisdom, you should ask, right? You should ask and it will be given to you, both in Proverbs and James. And meditate upon that, right? You remember, as Moses speaks to the Israelites in the wilderness, God tells him, remember these words in the morning, recite them to yourselves when you go out of your door and when you come in, when you walk along the roads, when your children asks you, why do we do these things the way that we do? You can tell them our story. All right, so those are some of the tools that I use to notice these themes through the Bible. Does that sound good? Yeah, okay, someone's awake out there. Good. All right. And maybe in time I'll come up with a more memorable acronym. But today we're talking about the theme of the city. The city. As I said, we're looking at a setting today rather than an abstract idea. So the city. If you are looking for a theme, it's usually best to start at the beginning, as I alluded to, and it will likely be something that's translated throughout the whole Bible. Okay? So the Hebrew word for city is ear, sort of like the word we use for these things here, ear. And the thing that sets a biblical city apart, or the word city in the Bible, is a wall. So it's a collection of dwellings, a collection of people who live within a wall that encases the whole settlement. And that'll be important to keep in mind. That's not something that's true of our cities today. True of some, but not most of ours, right? In our context, in our time now. So where does this theme kick off in the Bible, right? So if I can if you recall back to the beginning of the Bible, as I said, you have God shape man out of the dirt, breathe his life into him in the garden, right? The first thing God says is not good in his creation is that man is alone, right? Every day for 6 days, he looks at what he created and says, this is good. He makes man and says, this is very good. He sees man is alone and says, this is not good. So what does he do? He builds man a helper, a helpmate, a delivering ally. He takes the side of man and builds him a delivering ally. I use that vocabulary specifically based off the Hebrew words that are used. Instead of rising up to the injunction that God placed on them to fill the earth, be fruitful, multiply, rule over the earth, instead of ruling over the creatures of the land, they listen and fall to the deception of one of the creatures in the garden, right, are cast out, and the relationship between God and man is severed, is broken, is damaged. So we pick up the story outside of the land of Eden. We're told Adam and Eve have had 2 sons, Cain and Abel, right? Cain works the ground and works to produce crops, while Abel is a herdsman, and they both offer sacrifices to the Lord. God regards Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's, and Cain is jealous. So jealous, in fact, to the point where he considers killing his brother. First time the idea of murder is brought into the biblical story. Let me turn there. If you want to follow along, we're in Genesis 4. Okay. So, as Cain becomes jealous of his brother Abel, the Lord sees this and says to him, "Why are you furious? Why do you look despondent or cast down? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you don't do what's right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you to overcome you, but you must rule over it. Sin, first time the word sin is used in the Bible. Sin, like a giant animal crouching, preying upon you, ready to leap upon you and devour you. But you can rule over it, and you must rule over it. Just as Adam and Eve were called to rule over the earth, so Cain is called to rule over sin. But he falls victim to sin. He listens to the voice of this crouching animal, and he murders his brother Abel, right? God confronts Cain, and he says, Abel's blood cries out to me from the ground, right? You can imagine the visceral reaction when you see blood, right? Some people have very strong reaction when they see blood. But blood outside of the body is not normal. It demands an explanation. It cries out from the ground, right? Cries out. And God says that he is going to cast Cain out of the land, just as Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. That no longer, as he works the ground, is it going to yield its crops for him. So he's going to cast him out. But Cain answers him in verse 13, my punishment is too great. It's too much. Since you're banishing me from the soil, I must hide myself from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. The Lord replies, in that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And he gives Cain a sign of protection, a sign of this promise, that as Cain goes forth, that he has God's protection, or a promise of avengement at least. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And pay attention. What happens next? Cain takes a wife, has a son, and builds a city. Takes a wife, has a son, builds a city. The last time something was built was when God built a delivering ally for Adam, a helpmate, a helper in the garden, right? Took his very side and formed Eve. That's the last time something was built in the Bible. And now God has promised protection and deliverance to Cain. But instead of trusting to that sign, he builds his own protection. Remember that biblical cities are encased in walls. You can go to the next slide there. Cain builds a city and protects himself within its walls. No longer is he trusting to God's protection, but he's doing what seems right in his own eyes and constructing his own protection, right? Taking things onto his own terms, just as Adam and Eve did. So it should beg the question of what the author is trying to communicate with us, right? Are we really meant to see this as a good thing, that Cain builds a city? And you'll see this idea reflected later and more and more in later iterations. And it becomes clear that we are not, that this is a rejection of God's protection and Cain seeking out his own. You can go to that next slide. Just as the animal crouched behind Cain and he gave in to it, so now he, instead of trusting to God's protection, he is going to trust to his own strength. So where does this theme go from here? As we follow the line of Cain through the following verses, we go through 7 generations until we come to a man named Lamech. A great warrior king of the city, right? And Lamech, the Bible says he takes 2 wives. Eve was given 1. Even Cain took 1 wife. Lamech takes 2 wives. Interesting. And he says this. He says, "Hear my voice, wives of Lamech. Pay attention to my words, for I killed a man just for wounding me, a young man for striking me, for wounding my honor. If Cain was to be avenged 7 times, then for Lamech it will be 77 times. 77 times over. Now no longer am I ruling this city just for the protection of my own life, but now if a child were to so much as insult me, I will strike them down and be proud of it." So you see how within this city, this culture of violence and protection of life by the threat of violence has grown and grown, has been amplified over time. And it doesn't stop there. As we follow this story along to Genesis 11, you can go to the next slide, we see this theme amplified further and further as all the people in the land, speaking one language, gather together and say to themselves, "Let's build a tower that reaches up to heaven. Why fill the earth, being fruitful, multiplying, subduing it, when we can do what's right, what seems right in our own eyes? We can trust to our own strength, and we can reach up to heaven. We can take that power for ourselves." So all the peoples of the world are building this tower up to heaven. God sees what's going on. He sees that the people are not obeying his command to fill the earth, being fruitful and multiplying. So he confuses their language and scatters them over the face of the earth. And then the tower in the city is called Babylon, confusion, babblers. And we see the pattern through Genesis 1 through 11 is repeated time and time again throughout the Old Testament, especially, both on small scales and large. But in this slide, I want to draw your contrast between what we've seen from the city so far and what you may recall from the Garden of Eden, right? The garden where everything was as it should be. Everything was as God created it to be. The city is encased in walls that humans built up to protect themselves, to protect their wealth, to protect their lives by the threat of violence, with a tower reaching up to heaven to claim that power for themselves. Meanwhile, the garden did not have any walls, and in its very center, instead of a tower, was the tree of life. And from it were the rivers that flowed out to all of the world, right? The one river that became 4 rivers that went to the 4 largest collections of civilization, as the beginning of Genesis describes. And I want to recall your attention to one of the tools I pointed out before of perspective or practicing perspective, right? If you were to zoom out, you were to say, well, if this is a theme in the Bible, then I should see it in the very end as well, right? So if you're familiar, the Bible is often called meditative literature. Some things that don't make sense as you read through it the first time make more and more sense the more you know of the whole story, right? It's a living book. And the tree of life, right, after mankind is cast out of the garden, is not something we see again until the very end of the book, right? Not that we don't remember it, not that it isn't mentioned, not that our attention isn't called back to it, but we don't see the tree of life again until the end of the book, the very end of time, in John's vision of Revelation, when God makes the world whole again, right? But there's a surprise there, right? When God redeems the world, we don't see a garden at the end of the book. We see a garden city. Everything we've seen from the city so far in the story of the Bible is not very encouraging. It's not very good. It amplifies evil. It amplifies the worst parts of the human heart. But by the end of the story, we're surprised by the fact that God redeems the story, redeems the city, that he brings the garden into the city. I'm going to explore that a little bit more, but just to put that into your heads a little bit. Okay. Babylon becomes the archetypal city, the example city, right? Its violence, its mayhem is amplified as we go through the stories of the Bible, as you go through Sodom and Gomorrah, as you go through Nineveh, and ultimately the empire of Babylon itself. Each one becoming bigger and badder and full of more evil than the last, and each surrounded by its walls. But is there such a thing as a good city? If we see a garden city at the end of this story, how did we get from there to here, right? How did we get from Babylon to a garden city? And we start to see glimmers of hope throughout the story of the Bible. First, in this story of Joseph, right, as he goes down to the land of Egypt, he takes this, he starts in a pit in a desert place, is brought into the royal palace, is elevated above everything, every other position, and he turns a barren wilderness into a lush, plentiful garden where there's enough for everyone, right? By the wisdom of God, they set aside stores from 7 years of plenty to survive 7 years of famine. And he brings the family of God down into this land. And it's always called the land of Egypt, not a specific city, but we start to question, can a city be good? Can we see good things come from a city? And the predominant city within the biblical author's imagination is the city of Jerusalem, another city surrounded by walls. The city of David, the city David conquered, and the city to which he brought the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's relationship with man. As he brings it into the city, there's much celebration, there's much dancing, much music. David out front playing the role of the high priest in his robe as he leads this procession. A prefiguring image of the future priestly king that we will look forward to. But he leads it into the city. He's dancing. He takes a few steps. They stop, offer a sacrifice, take a few more steps, offer another one. So a big party as they come into the city of Jerusalem. And we begin to wonder, is this the redemption of the city? Is this where God's kingdom is now going to dwell? After all, we brought the very symbol of God's presence into a city, right? Out of the garden into a city. So what does this mean? And things are looking up. But sin is crouching at the door. And during the time when kings go away to war, David is standing out on his balcony and sees another man's wife bathing. Sin is crouching at the door. He desires her for his own and arranges to murder her husband so he can take her for his own. His blood cried out to God in the same way that Abel's did. David ultimately making the same failure as Cain. So what looked like it was going to be the city of God has again turned to the city of Cain. Sin was crouching at the door, and even David, the person for whom the most is written in the Bible, second to Jesus, right? The one to whom we have been looking forward to as our redemption so far in the story, has fallen. And so his descendants fall. Though some try to resist, ultimately you see the cycle of violence, of evil grow larger and larger in an ever-widening spiral until God's people are taken into exile by Babylon, by the empire of that city of old, who's even worse than them, right? You remember the words of Jeremiah as that fate is coming upon them. Jeremiah criticizing the city of Jerusalem, saying it's become even more corrupt than Sodom and Gomorrah, even more corrupt than Babylon, even worse than Egypt, even worse than any other city we have seen up to this point. The city of God has fallen. So where does that leave us? What hope does that leave for us today? And that's where Jesus comes into this story, right? When things are looking at their worst, when we've gone hundreds of years without a word from God, without someone new to lead us, Jesus appears on the scene. You can go to the next slide. And Jesus says a lot of interesting things, right? If you would like to follow me, you can turn to Matthew 5:14. Matthew gathers his disciples not in the city of Jerusalem, but up on the surrounding hills and farmland, and he says, "You are the light of the world. You are the city on a hill that cannot be hidden. You, my followers, my people, are the city I'm seeking to build." And he described himself as the new Jerusalem. You'll recall shortly before the final week of Jesus' life, as he looks over and he sees the city of Jerusalem, he weeps over it, knowing what's to come. In one of the last times he publicly speaks before that week, he says, God will tear down this temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And the leaders are threatened by that, right? The leaders in the city who have depended upon the preservation of life by the threat of violence and have trusted to their own strength are threatened by these words. But Jesus wasn't referring to a physical temple. He was referring to himself. Jesus as the new temple. Jesus as the embodiment of God's presence. In the very beginning of John, you'll recall it says, Jesus was the Word, right? Was there from the beginning. He came to live among us. He moved into the neighborhood. That word is the same word as tabernacle. It's the same word as that dwelling in the desert where God's presence was kept. He tabernacled amongst us. He became the embodiment of God's presence, God's dwelling place. And then he looks at his followers and says, you are the city. You are the light. You are going to house the presence of God that this world is going to look to. So what are we to think about all of this? As he is arrested, beaten, and brought before the religious leaders of his time, and they're questioning him, he looks up to heaven and says that he will be enthroned, that he will sit at the right hand of God, and he will be enthroned over all of this, and is alluding to the time when heaven meets earth, when the garden is brought into the city. And that's what he is coming to do. He underwent the most severe punishment of death, and prove that he was stronger than death. How do you claim victory over death? You prove that you are stronger than death itself, right? He was put to death, and then 3 days later was risen back to life. And he brought a new way of life and a new hope to all those that follow him. You can go to the next slide there. As Jesus' followers today, we are tasked with bringing heaven to earth, with bringing the garden to the city. Right? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We are called to bring the garden into the city. I'll call your attention to a couple verses that highlight that. Paul describes us as the ambassadors of Christ, right? In 2 Corinthians 5:20. He said, therefore we are ambassadors of Christ, certain that God is appealing through us. We plead on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to him. Enjoy the new life that he has brought us. Right? Again in Ephesians 2:19. So then you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ himself as the cornerstone. The whole building being put together by him grows into a holy sanctuary in the Lord. You are being built together for God's dwelling in the city. And this is not something that was forgotten by the prophets in the Old Testament, but it's something that they looked forward to themselves. If I can call your attention back to Jeremiah, everyone's favorite chapter, Jeremiah 29, verse 7. See, as Jeremiah is writing a letter to those who were exiled out to Babylon, this is what the Lord said, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives to your sons and give your daughters in marriage. Multiply there. Be fruitful and multiply. Seek the welfare of the city I've deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf. For when it has prosperity, you will prosper. Going down to verse 12, you will call to me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. Right? I can speak about Isaiah verse 60. Right? As Isaiah is describing his looking forward to this garden city. Nations will come to your light and kings to the brightness of your radiance. Raise your eyes and look around. They will all gather and come to you. Your sons will come from far away, and your daughters will be carried on the hip. You will see and be radiant, and your heart will tremble and rejoice, because the riches of the sea will become yours. All the wealth of the nations will come to you. Foreigners will build up walls, and their kings will serve you. Verse 11, your gates will always be open. They will never be shut, day or night, so that the wealth of the nations may be brought to you, with their kings being led in procession. The sun will no longer be your light by day, and the brightness of the moon will not shine on you, but the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your splendor. Now let's look at the end of the story to John's vision of this coming garden city. Revelation 21. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The old had passed away. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven like a bride for her wedding. I heard a loud voice from the throne. Look, God's dwelling is in humanity, right? Christ is the new temple, the new tabernacle, the new dwelling with us. We are part of that new city. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will no longer exist. Grief, crying, pain will exist no longer, because the previous things have passed away. And the one seated on the throne says, "Look, I make all things new." Verse 21. There are 12 gates and 12 pearls. Each gate was made of a single pearl. I didn't see a sanctuary in it, because the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its sanctuary. The city doesn't need the sun or the moon to shine on it, because God's glory keeps it alight. Nations will walk in its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Each day, its gates will never close, because it will never be night there. It will bring the glory and honor of the nations into it. The picture of this garden city is one of redemption, is one of hope. God's ideal for humanity was not simply a return to the garden, but he took what humans had built for themselves, for their own protection, and he redeemed it. The city of God has walls, but its gates will never be closed. The walls have been decommissioned, like the holes in Christ's hands and the wound in his side. They stand testament to God's victory over death, to his redemption of mankind's failures. He does not erase those wounds, but he lets them stand as a testament to his redemption. And so it's something exciting that we have to look forward to. It's something incredible. You can go to the last slide. So how do we seek the garden city? If our injunction is to bring the garden city here, is to make heaven more like earth, how do we do that? The city was defined by its walls, by the exclusion of other people, by the fear of losing what wealth and life we have to others, and trusting to our own strength to protect them. God's garden city is defined by gates that will never close. No one will be turned away. Everyone will be welcomed into this light. And we have been tasked with starting that process now. Wherever we are, just like the words the Lord spoke to his people in exile in Babylon, we are to be fruitful, to multiply, to build gardens, to seek the welfare of our city, even in exile. We're to give generously. Instead of trusting to our own protection to protect our lives and our wealth, and trusting to the threat of violence, we're to give generously, to love radically, to give as if we're never going to run out. Because ultimately, we believe that we won't. We believe that God will always provide, just like he provided the fishes and loaves, just like he provided the oil and bread for Elijah and the widow, that God will always provide. There will always be enough. And there's enough for everyone. Every tribe, every nation, every people, every tongue, we are to bring into this garden city. And we are to start making our city look more like his. So I encourage you to study, to try to remember and use some of the tools that I've found helpful, to notice themes in the Bible, to ask yourselves, what are the authors trying to tell me through this? What do they want me to learn? And recall Jesus' injunction to persistence within the Bible. He does not simply say, ask, seek, knock, but keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. Those who run the race to completion will be rewarded. The widow who keeps knocking on the corrupt judge's door all night long is the one who will receive justice. Actively love. Remember that love is a verb. It is something we are supposed to do each and every day. That we are supposed to give generously, right? We're supposed to live radically. The early generations of the church had that well in mind as they gave everything that they owned for the good of everyone else within the family of Christ, right? We provide for each other's needs, and we give generously without expecting anything back, but knowing that God will provide for us. And grow, and I say that as a verb and an injunction, as an encouragement as well. Seek to grow your faith as you would try to cultivate a garden. Weed out the doubts. Clean out the rocks. Water it regularly. And actively seek to grow the church, to grow his garden city. Okay. I'll invite the worship team to come back up as we sing a song of closing as I pray here. So, dear Jesus, we thank you for today. We thank you for being here with us, God, for helping us to learn more about you and what you are trying to teach us. Help us to exemplify the virtues of the garden, to live generously, and to believe that you will always provide for us. Give us grace, and let your love flow through us to those around us. I'll invite you all to stand as we sing one last song, after which we'll close up for the day.